Hello, how are you? I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk with you about Chapter 7 of the textbook Society in Focus, and the topic is Deviance and Conformity. And these are topics that are crucial when you think about social order and our social life. What counts as behavior that's not acceptable, and what counts as acceptable? And what's the range of behavior? How do we deal with problems when people act outside of what's expected? And this is, again, the heart of this chapter. And I'm going to go through the information as I have before with you on overhead projected outlines with definitions. And if you're able to take these down, as well as some of the information I talked to you about here in this voice thread format, that should help quite a bit for you. To begin, the basic definitions, and if you want to, you can focus in on this slide to make it look clearer for you. Deviance and conformity. Deviance, most people know this idea of violating a social norm. Conformity, of course, adherence to the social norm. But this isn't as simple as it might seem. What counts as adherence? What's the range of acceptable behavior? There's a discussion initially in your textbook about a group of people riding high-powered motorcycles into a small community, and the idea that these might be criminal or deviant elements. But then as the bikers come on the scene, they look maybe like they're Hell's Angels or some other motorcycle gang. It comes to be discovered that they are actually driving $10,000 to $20,000+ motorcycles. So these are not thugs. These are not a criminal element. They're people who are rebels on the weekend, if you will, and they've bought machines that are only available probably to people who are middle class. So this idea of the new biker subculture and a pseudo-deviant role, I think it's fascinating to consider. So some basic terms that we've discussed in a previous discussion with class: norms and what types of norms, how do they operate? Prescriptive means what you should do. Postscriptive, what you should not do. And so prescriptive would be things like manners. You should use your knife and fork when you eat. Proscriptive, don't murder, don't steal. More terms that we've already talked about, so I won't go into in great depth. Taboos, prohibitions against unthinkable acts, and some of the examples I think I've given you before: cannibalism and incest. Mores are formal rules, and mores are the basis for law in the United States. Folkways we've talked about before: informal rules, and informal rules that don't usually have any kind of formalized sanction. So if you don't use your knife and fork when you eat, people might stare at you and think that's odd, but you will probably not encounter police making you do those things. Law, these are formal rules that are enforced by a state, and there are always three levels of state or government. You can talk about law at the local level, the state level, as in the state of Nebraska or Wyoming, and then the federal level. The chapter deals with certain kinds of questions that are typically asked by sociologists. And there's a notion, ROT, the range of tolerance, that is a lot of fun to consider. And the example I usually use for the range of tolerance is if you go drive on I-80. And I'm sure many of you have driven on this road or similar roads. And the question I have for you is, how fast do you go? Some people invariably answer the speed limit, which is currently 75 miles an hour. Other people might say 79 miles an hour, which is an interesting number. Some people go much higher. Some people may even go a little lower. But the interesting thing, I think, is that you have a posted speed limit, 75 miles an hour. But you have people, large groups I would argue, who systematically push that up and violate that law. Probably one of the most common responses I get is 79 miles an hour. And I ask why that is. And a lot of the time, the rationale is, well, 80 miles an hour might get you a ticket. That's the cutoff point for a fine. And so that's this notion of people who want to get somewhere quickly but don't want to get penalized. So you have a very odd situation on this road. You have clear indications of a law which says this is the standard. You have clear groups of people violating that law, right? Who all go a little bit faster, and some people who go substantially faster. And then you have points at which there are police. I'm sure some of you have seen these on I-80, sitting there usually in the medians. And when those people are present, what does that do to affect your perception of the range of tolerance? So how is the range of tolerance for behavior determined? What stops people, for example, from getting facial tattoos? What encourages some people to get tattoos on other parts of their body, particularly parts that they might be able to conceal? Okay, so what's the range of acceptable and unacceptable behavior? And how do our stated laws get enforced but not necessarily enforced? Okay, so this range of tolerance occupies a lot of the theorizing of people in the field of deviance and criminology. Who determines that range of tolerance? Okay, in my example on I-80, is it the state, which has the posted law, the police, which are there perhaps to enforce it or not, the groups of people who may systematically violate that law together and reinforce each other's behavior? Next, how are feelings, thoughts, and behaviors kept inside the range of tolerance? Okay, do you check yourself? Do other people check you? Is it something where you internalize norms and values and maybe morals that say, I should not do this? Or is it another outside force that stops you from behaving in a bad way? Why might a person have feelings, thoughts, or behaviors that fall outside of the range of tolerance? In one example, you could say somebody may cut you off in traffic, and you might get very angry at that person. You might want to pull them over and take out your tire iron and smash up their car, right? But something stops you, and perhaps it's your feeling of, I don't want to get arrested. I feel very angry right now, but my anger would not be justified in terms of acting out in that aggressive a manner. Okay, so people have a range of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that they have to rein in and express maybe in a different kind of way. Maybe you might call the police. Maybe you might call 911 on your cell phone and say, look, there's somebody who's driving erratically or flipping people off and acting badly, and I'd like you to deal with it. Okay, so this is a very complicated mental procedure and an issue of behavior in public. And that relates to the last point. What happens when somebody's feelings, thoughts, or behaviors fall outside the range of tolerance? Probably many of you watching this have thought to yourself at one point, man, I'd like to kill that guy. You know, somebody's really ticked you off in terms of what you've done. What happens if you were to act on those ideas or feelings? And the fascinating thing is, how many of you have had thoughts or feelings that are very antisocial and potentially criminal, but somehow rein that in and stop? Because I think this is crucial for the reproduction of human social life. Finally, you can ask, why does the range of tolerance seem to shift and slide for different people? How is it that different people are held to different standards of judgment in terms of their tolerance, or I'm sorry, their behavior being accepted or not? Here's an example. If you get pulled over by a police officer today for speeding, would you necessarily be treated the same way as would the mayor's son or daughter? It's an open question. Also, how might people be given a pass or not for behavior depending on things like their race, sex, age, other variables that we embody? Why is it that driving while black has become such an issue? And that's a term that's been used as a generic term for what's called racial profiling. Certain individuals of minority status might feel like they're targeted by the police for things that dominant racial groups, for example, get a pass on. They don't get stopped for. And so these are fascinating questions because they relate to how our social life may be very, very different depending on your social position and your statuses. Conformity versus deviance. If you think about what counts as conformity and what's deviant, it relates to certain variables as well as, for example, the ones we just discussed. The time, when you can also in your notes put down era, okay? So, for example, I have here drunk driving 40 years ago versus drunk driving today. 40 years ago, there did not exist this group called MAD, and it's an acronym I'm sure you've heard, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Why would mothers, of all the people, be such an important group for promoting a new view of drinking and driving as criminal? Mothers have children, and you can conceptualize mothers as being the ones grieving if their child is killed through the, in the most simple words, thoughtless actions of a drunk driver. Okay, so that was something, though, that needed to change over time. Believe it or not, 40-odd years ago, it was not a criminal thing at all to drink and drive. Eventually, though, the social movement, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, helped to make that a change in law so that it was criminal, along with technology like breathalyzers. So that means that what counts as deviant or criminal changes over time. The place also makes a difference. If you're in a library, the way you would comport yourself, the behavior that's acceptable, is of course very different from if you're at Memorial Stadium, for example. The situation, not dissimilar from the place, but you can also think, for example, within the same place, you might tell a joke to a friend very differently than you would perhaps to a coworker, or maybe not at all. So your place, your situation, I should say, also informs the way that you act and what's considered acceptable or not. Finally, culture. Norms vary from culture to culture. We've talked in class about the norm, for example, in French culture, of males kissing each other on the cheek when they greet. So culture very much informs what we think of as acceptable or not. And that relates directly to your textbook, the Sociological Focus 7.1, which I have on page 167. And if you haven't read this, take a few minutes and look at it, because this is a fascinating example of cultural misunderstanding. The way this played out, there was a couple. They were in New York City, and they were from Denmark. They had a stroller with their infant inside, and they decided to go into a restaurant and have a bite to eat. So they left their stroller outside of a New York City restaurant. This is perfectly acceptable behavior, believe it or not, in Denmark, because Denmark has a very homogeneous society with a very low crime rate. Anyway, you can kind of imagine what might happen when people leave their stroller with their child outside of a restaurant in a teeming city like New York City. The police came. They said this child was abandoned. It says in your textbook the child had been turned over to Child Protective Services, CPS. The couple was being placed under arrest for child abandonment. The couple was shocked. They couldn't believe what was happening. Now, the twist in this story is that this received international media attention, especially the attention of Danish authorities and people in prominent positions there, who then decried this enforcement of law in New York City saying, look, this is a cultural norm for our people, and you're holding them to a standard that they didn't know about. And so here it says, Sorensen explained that in her home country of Denmark, it was common for parents to leave infants unattended in strollers outside restaurants and shops. So the media attention helped make it so that they were eventually released and no charges were filed against this couple. But I think this is a very interesting way of considering the next part of this overhead, what deviance involves. First of all, who is it who's involved? In this case, the actor, and I don't mean actor like in movie actor, but the person, okay? And his or her characteristics, right? So, for example, the race, age, sex of the person involved and their characteristics, what country they're from. You can also say who is observing, right? Are the police observing? Are other members of the community observing who may report this? Is it a friend? For example, all these can play into how a behavior is considered deviant or conformist. Finally, in some instances, you have the event being framed by the media. Okay, so some media accounts can see a protest as peaceful. Some might say that people were acting violently, and those things might come to influence the public perception of that. It takes a little while, but your textbook eventually gets around to the notion of crime, and it defines it as any act that violates a criminal law. And next, what we see is a definition of hate crime. So you have a crime, violation of any law, right, the criminal law, and the idea of a hate crime is a criminal act against people or property that's motivated by some racial or ethnic prejudice or some other social bias. So again, a criminal act against people or property motivated by racial or ethnic prejudice or some other social bias. As an example, someone's sexuality, someone having a disability. Okay, those would be considered hate crimes. And in the next slide, I want to show you an example of some of the dilemmas that we have in the United States and the debates about why you might have this category of hate crime. Protester after an event that happened in Wyoming several years ago, the University of Wyoming at Laramie. A fellow named Richard Osborne, 74-year-old, was protesting the funeral of a young man, Matthew Shepard. Matthew Shepard had been killed, and he was gay. He was a student at the University of Wyoming, and he had been attacked by some young men and left to die on a fence, one of those snow fences you see to stop the snow blowing across the roads. If you've ever driven on, say, for example, the interstate in Wyoming, you've seen these. So this fellow, with his, you can't fully see it here, but up above he has his Veteran of Foreign Wars cap on, so he's served his country. He's 74 years old, and he was protesting this funeral, and he has a fascinating little sign up, and it says, "Freedom of choice is the right to hate." And so the idea of a hate crime is something that has developed over time. We didn't have it 50 years ago. The paradox I'd like you to note in the United States is that we have two amendments that are opposing. Okay, they have a tension between them, and I'd like you to note them. Most of you know the First Amendment. The First Amendment is free speech, okay? And we clearly have that in the United States, the right to speak to each other, right to a free press, right to assemble, these kinds of things, freedom of speech and assembly. The other one I'd like you to know, the other amendment is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is equal protection under law. And that means minority group members also have equal protection under law. So this is a huge tension in the United States, which has really given rise to the notion of hate crimes. And I think it's embodied quite clearly in this fellow sign. And the paradox we have in this country is freedom of choice the right to hate or not? And I'll talk about this more in the next slide. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the 14th Amendment, equal protection under law, has played out in a lot of different ways in the United States, and I want to draw your attention to this article that ran in Time magazine. I know you can't really see this text very well. If you want to, you can Google the title and Time magazine, Why the Supreme Court Ruled for Westboro. Westboro, you might remember, was a church, Westboro Baptist Church, out of Topeka, Kansas. And this case involved these people in this church protesting soldiers' funerals in the United States. They would hold up signs and they would stay, I guess it was about 1,000 feet or so away from the funeral itself, but they would hold up signs that were very provocative. Soldiers would come home in caskets, and they would hold signs up at the outside of the area where the funeral was held saying, "Thank God for 9/11, you're going to hell, and thank God for dead soldiers." You can imagine how sickening these might be for the family members of these soldiers. And so one family member, Albert Snyder, sued the Westboro Baptist Church. This was argued in the Supreme Court. Do these members of this church have the right to protest these funerals? Because Albert Snyder wanted to shut this down and stop any other family member of a dead soldier from experiencing this kind of thing at their memorial. It turns out that the Supreme Court said, indeed, Westboro does have the right to protest because they were not seen as personal attacks on the soldier, but they were political statements. And so again, what counts as hate and what counts as free speech in the United States is very contested, but something that we'll talk about in the next slide related to why hate crimes exist and what they're supposed to do. Which leads to the notion of hate crime and what counts as a hate crime. Here's the definition again, which I repeated in a previous slide. But can you think of a reason why a criminal act that's against people who are, for example, in a minority status, maybe, say, for example, who are gay or who are disabled, why there might be what's called an added penalty for a crime against those people versus just a normal crime? And let me clarify what I mean by this. Can you think of why it might be that if someone is murdered, okay, we have laws on the books that deal with murder in a very strong way. Why is it, though, that there might be an added penalty for someone who is murdered as the result of a hate crime? Can you think of why? The reason is because of a concept that I'd like you to note in your notes. Social harm. Social harm is directly related to the idea of crime because the idea with a hate crime is there's more social harm because it actually not only harms the individuals who have had these things perpetrated against, but it also harms the whole minority group by threatening them, by violating their sense of safety in the world. As an example, if I were to go out and spray paint graffiti on some building at UNK, and I wrote, Borchardt rules on that building, that's vandalism. If I were to write a swastika on that same building, then that's a hate crime because it's meant to intimidate a group of people. That's why there's an elevated penalty, because of this notion of social harm. Okay? Next, your text talks about stigma. And stigma is something that we all intuitively know, but there's a clear definition. It's related to a work by Erving Goffman. And this idea here, it says a characteristic setting an individual apart, disqualifying, discrediting that person from full social acceptance and participation. And in your text, there's even a picture, which I can't necessarily show you very well, but I'll try on page 173, of the Elephant Man as an example. And there are three categories Goffman discussed related to forms of stigma. The Elephant Man is a clear example of the abomination of the body. So some type of physical deformity that people have that sets them apart. My question is, do tattoos and piercings count today as abominations of the body? And it's a fun thing to think about, because it involves that range of tolerance again. Think to yourself, perhaps you work a job, and is it something where your employer has rules that say you can or cannot have certain types of visible piercings or tattoos? That's interesting, because they set a standard then for the way you present yourself, perhaps at their business. I know that in Nebraska, if you want to be part of the state troopers, you can't, I believe, have a tattoo visible from your elbow down. So the question is do some people take on a voluntary form of stigma? And another thing you can ask is that a form of stigma, or is it changing? What's considered cool, or something that an individual has a right to do for self-expression, versus what another group of people might see as a stigma? Okay? Things that you can't see can also be stigmas, like a blemish of individual character. You can't necessarily look at someone and say, oh, that person's a liar, that person is a drunk, right? But those things are stigmatic too if somebody finds out. The third type that Goffman discussed, tribal stigmas. And this is people who are stigmatized because of race, religion, ethnicity, or some other characteristic. The example I have of this is in Nazi Germany in World War II, Jews were stigmatized very heavily and blamed for many things that they had nothing to do with. The economy crashing, losing World War II, losing World War I. World War I. They're blamed because of their religion, and they were seen as a force that polluted pure German culture and society. The medical model of deviance, I have a couple of slides which show images related to this in a moment, and I'll show you. This, though, is an inherently sociological notion, and it's that there are things today which are medicalized, and that is something which is eventually seen as a problem that's dealt with through drugs. Here's an example for you. I'm sure some of you know somebody who has taken Ritalin, and if it's been prescribed to them, you know typically what that's for. The example is ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Okay? So a question for you is, at what point did we start to come up with a medical label for something which used to some extent, be considered just normal behavior for children? What's the line between someone being hyperactive and someone just acting like a child? I know that when I was a kid, I had a heck of a lot of extra energy, and I did some crazy stuff. I used to, take my bicycle and, run full bore into trees, stuff that seems kind of weird today. But this notion that people are now addressing what might be considered social issues through an individualized label as somebody needing medical treatment or surgery or some type of clinical treatment, for example, psychological treatment, rather than through some kind of social transformation. And here's a thing to think about. The rise in the medicalization of deviance and labeling of ADHD and the corresponding use of Ritalin also corresponds to some extent with social changes in schools, like, for example, great pressure on schools to reduce their budgets and therefore cutting programs like, for example, recess or gym, programs that would allow kids to expel some of the energy that they have. So this is something I'd like you to think about. It's a little abstract, but it's really useful to think about today. The medical model of deviance, and I'll show you another image in a second to help you with this. Deviance through an ad that I found in a magazine. And the idea is that we have more of a 24-hour society than we've ever had before. People work a lot of odd shifts, and that includes nurses, police officers, people who are checkers at Walmart and other stores. What's happened is something that's been perfectly natural and normal, okay? If you feel sleepy working during the hours in which you would normally sleep, has been labeled a medical problem. So it says here, I'm sorry you can't see this too well, but it says, do you work odd hours or shifts? Are you sleepy on the job? And it says excessive sleepiness that could be due to what they called shift work disorder. They've given it a medical label, and then it says here, and you can't really see this too well, but that there's a drug that they're trying to give people to address their disorder, and it's called Nuvigil, Nuvigil, if you want to Google that, look it up online. So they've taken something that you could argue is kind of a social problem, and they've made it an individual problem. And they've said, oh, okay, well, you deal with your individual problem with this med, okay? Rather than thinking about social transformation and the idea that we've created this problem through our own social life. Here's another great example. In the past, there was this idea of people who would shop too much, excessively. And you had actually a term that came up, a medical term that was created called compulsive shopping disorder, CSD. And they came up with a treatment for this, a medical treatment. And the fascinating thing is to think about these people who are compulsively shopping, labeled with this, and then given pills. You could say to yourself, well, isn't this really a social problem? Maybe it's the result of a culture where people are inundated with ads to say, here's some stuff you should have or want, and maybe you ought to pursue it because the advertisements never stop. So the question of, do these drugs and this individualization inhibit social transformations that would really solve the problem? That's the question. Of deviance. This statement here, the practice of equating deviance with sickness emphasizes individualistic explanations rather than sociological explanations of deviance. So the blame is put on the individual, and the way the problem is addressed is through the individual, through the medication or surgery, as I mentioned, rather than through social transformation. One thing I like to think about is the evolution of ideas, how ideas started from one set of thought and then develop progressively from there. And your textbook also considers this, that there are many different possible explanations for crime and deviance. And you've got, for example, biological medical perspectives. You can have psychological explanations, as well as sociological explanations for deviance. So biological medical would include things like, for example, somebody having imbalance in their brain chemistry, or, for example, a tumor which impedes certain inhibitor of violent behavior in their brain. Psychological might be related to parental discipline and emotional issues raised in childhood that might explain crime and deviance. And there are also sociological explanations, which we will talk about in a minute. But it's important to think about, where did we begin thinking about how to deal with crime and deviance and how we conceptualize it. And the first thing that your textbook mentions is a practice from the Middle Ages, and it's demonology. So in the Middle Ages in Europe, the original conception of why people committed crime was this notion they were possessed, that they had some deal, maybe perhaps they made with the devil, or they were in league with the devil. And the thing there is that you don't have much free will once you're possessed, okay? So if you don't have free will, you really can't fully be rehabilitated. And that's important because it shows a theory about crime and deviance, and also an explanation of what ought to be done from there. And I'm going to show you a slide related to this, and then get back to this slide to continue our discussion. The slide did not turn out as well as I would have hoped on this voice thread, but if you can zoom in on it, I think you'll be able to see a little better of what I'm speaking about. This is an example of what was called a trial by ordeal in the Middle Ages, and the idea that guilt was determined by ordeals. And in this instance, you have a woman and a man who have been accused of adultery, and the woman in particular, that's the focus of this. Again, if you zoom in, you'll see this a little bit better. Anyway, she was accused of adultery, and in the bottom of the slide around here, you can see there's a little box, and that's hot coals, which was used to heat the iron rod that is in her hand. And this trial by ordeal was, if you have done this act, then you should be able to grab this rod, and that will burn your flesh. If you haven't done this act, then no harm will come to you. Okay, so you can kind of see where this is going if you get to the level of a trial by ordeal. And the image here that you see, this painting from the Middle Ages, not only shows the trial, but it also up here, you can kind of see, shows the result of the trial. This stake with little smoke coming off of it in flames. This is showing the woman being burned at the stake afterward, because of course her flesh burned once she held the hot iron rod. An account of the trial of George Jacobs from August 5th, 1692, in a painting that was made in 1855. So again, this is the end of the Middle Ages, and we're talking about America here. It's the ordeal of Jacob, and he was a patriarch of Salem, Massachusetts. During the witch craze, where you see a lot of trial by ordeals, he ridiculed the trials, only to find himself being accused, tried, and executed. So demonology, even though it sounds very far-fetched to us now from our perspective, based on the Enlightenment and science, was very real, and the approach that they used had its logic, if you will, during that period. Now we'll talk more about scientific, biological, and psychological explanations of crime and deviance. Of demonology, which was the approach to crime and the theory about crime in the Middle Ages. We had the Enlightenment, as we've discussed before, promoting science and secularization, reason and rationality. And with that, scientific and biological explanations begin becoming prominent. And In particular, there's a few that I'd like you to know. One is by Cesar Lambroso, and his notion was called Atavism, where criminals are seen as less evolved, okay? If human evolution at this time is being conceptualized as becoming increasingly complex, then criminals for Cesar Lambroso had atavism or anomalies that made them less evolved creatures, explaining why they did what they did. They're throwbacks, okay? And this work actually corresponds a little bit with Charles Darwin's idea about evolution at the time that was popular. One popular idea, also corresponding with Lombroso, is phrenology. Phrenology is when people would scientifically study the bumps on someone's skull to see the extent to which they might have criminal tendencies. It was an indicator of character or personality. So someone might feel your skull and say, oh, you've got a big dip here, so you're going to be a child molester, right? And again, this sounds preposterous to us, but I'd like you to think about the logic of empiricism at this time. And empiricism, as we talked about, is the idea of experience derived from the senses. So people are trying to feel things on the skull as an inference to what's happening in the mind. And these are, I'd like you to think of as baby steps, small steps, toward eventually our understanding of things that isn't so silly, like, for example, different parts of the brain being equated with different faculties, okay? So even though it sounds ridiculous, they were trying to use empiricism to learn and understand more about why crime exists, what could be done also about crime. Then we move into sociological explanations, and the first one, usually structural functionalism, we talk about. The functionalist perspective here, the underlying theory with that are called strain theories, and the fellow who you associate with structural functionalism, hopefully, Durkheim. Emile Durkheim's notion of anomie is important here, and you can review it in your text. But Durkheim wanted to explain this transition from pre-industrial traditional societies to more modern societies. Because again, this was a very radical and upsetting, you could say, change for people. A dramatic change from old ways of life to a new way of life, a new social order, a new basis for truth, a new basis for political power. And what he found with anomie is that it's a state of normlessness. People aren't following the norms anymore. The norms are falling by the wayside. So the move to industrial society means that people have more freedom. They can do more of what they want to do because the norms aren't so hard and fast. Yet, this also means that we have weakened social bonds. And that means if, for example, you're in a big city and you don't know anybody and you don't have anything controlling you, you have the potential for more crime, more suicide, and more antisocial behavior. Durkheim's work. And as I say here, Durkheim's idea of anomie. Anomie is normlessness for Durkheim. And this is important because you can see that there's less social control in industrial societies. The homogeneous societies that people came from, Durkheim labeled those mechanical societies, and they had mechanical solidarity. People agreed on rules and norms. They came from similar social background and had a shared religion. In industrial society, we moved to organic solidarity. And you may recall that means we're interdependent on each other for task specialization. That's what holds us together rather than shared norms. So we have more freedom, but we also have more crime. Merton is the next theorist who took Durkheim's ideas and tweaked them, modified them. And for Merton, he didn't say that. Anomie wasn't that the norms are falling apart, like Durkheim said. Merton said the norms are there. It's just that people can't always follow the norms. The norms are in conflict with social reality. So he's taking Durkheim and tweaking him and updating him to explain crime in America in particular. And to do that, he refers to the American dream. And I'm sure you've probably heard of this. And when I've asked students in the past, they've said things like, well, I say, what's the American dream? And they'll say things like, oh, white picket fence, house of your own kids, and the ability to succeed in a career and do well for yourself. And that's a pretty good definition. The idea that America offers a chance for things like wealth, prosperity, and prestige, like no other country on earth. Think about it. It's called the American dream. America is completely set apart from other countries because of our opportunity structure. Remember, we discussed the notion of meritocracy, a system based on merit. So the American dream is people come here from all over the world in order to be able to make something of themselves, given their own hard work and merit. So Merton looks at the American dream, but he also asks a question. Does everyone actually have access to the American dream? Do some people, given their status, racial, ethnic, sexual, age, what have you, sex, does everyone have equal access to the American dream? And he says no. In particular, people who are economically disadvantaged don't have the means to attain that goal. So they're going to be inhibited from it. And how are you going to feel if you're told, hey, you should have a Hummer, you should have these watches, this new iPhone, this new computer, all these things, but then you're not given the means to get them? Arguably, you'll feel strong frustration, okay? Because you'll feel like the current social structure is stopping you from achieving the goals that are being promoted, for example, by the media and as in general in American society. So Merton does a really nice systematic breakdown of how crime could be a result of frustration and anomie to some extent. Okay, it's a really nice theoretical, organized argument. He also creates a typology to say that some people are going to have more interest in crime than others. And so this is a three-part setup I have here for you, where you have the mode of adaptation, the cultural goal, and then the institutionalized means of achievement. I will give you a page number for this same chart, but written in a different way, on page 182 if you have that. Take a look. It's very similar to what I have. Okay. Some people, Merton said, are conformists. And what does this mean? This means they agree with the cultural goal, like the American dream. And they also agree with the institutionalized means of achieving it. So you arguably are a conformist. You're sitting here listening to this voice thread lecture, probably taking notes. You believe in the American dream, and you're going through the legitimate accepted cultural means of achieving it, study and hard work to achieve a degree. I'd like you to know that innovation and innovators are the ones Merton most associated with crime. Okay? And that is because they agree with the cultural goals. They say the American dream is good. This is a plus sign here, right? American dream good. But they don't have the institutionalized means to achieve it. So maybe they grew up in really bad neighborhoods with really bad school systems. Maybe they saw crime all around them. They say to themselves, well, I can't get ahead doing the normal things that people would to advance in society. I'm going to rob banks or steal cars. Okay? Innovators. He also had some other categories. Ritualists are people who don't really believe in the American dream, but they go through the motions, the institutionalized means. So, as an example, maybe somebody who says, well, I don't think I can achieve um, the car and the house with the white picket fence, but I'll show up for work and press my clothes and do what's expected of me. Retreatism was something Merton saw around the time he was writing this in the 50s and 60s, that there were some people who were saying, oh, I don't believe in the American dream and I don't believe in the institutionalized means, so they just pulled out of that whole possibility. Rebellion, you can think of as mixing and matching. They said, okay, I agree with some aspects of the American dream, but not others. I agree with some ways of achieving it that are legitimate, institutionalized, and others I don't agree with. Perspective and strain theories explaining crime. Next, we usually talk about the conflict perspective. And this one, uh, you could say, is also related to our previous discussion. At the conflict perspective, you might recall, is people are struggling over scarce resources. The metaphor is that society is like a war or a conflict, a battle. So here, the legal or criminal justice system, that's what CJ here stands for, criminal justice systems, are seen as geared to benefiting dominant groups in society, the haves rather than the have-nots. The people who have created the legal system are those who are in control. So that system, therefore, is seen as benefiting them. And you have a lot of possible examples of this. For example, people who engage in violent crime often receive much stiffer sentences than those who engage in property crime. So somebody who engages in armed robbery, and this is just an example, might get 15 years in prison, while somebody who does something that seems more innocuous, like price fixing, can receive a fine or a shorter sentence. And price fixing basically just means, for example, two or three businesses are trying to set their prices together to exploit a market. Okay, so they get rid of competition and take advantage of people. Now here's the thing though. Remember that notion of social harm, okay? Maybe violent crime should be dealt with harshly, but shouldn't we have also harsh sentences for people who engage in environmental crime? If you're dumping toxic waste into rivers, you're also causing a lot of social harm. And in fact, those people may get a slap on the wrist. And you could say, from the conflict perspective, because those are business owners and people who have high status, they get treated differently, and that's not a very fair system. A second critique within the conflict perspective of the criminal justice system is that capitalism relies on certain levels of poverty, okay? And that means that it promotes inequality. It also promotes, like we saw with the strain theory, consumption as a way to happiness as a status, but then also limits people's income. So it creates a contradiction. You can't simply say to your boss, hey, by the way, I've been working for you for a while and I want to buy more things, and so therefore I'd like more money from you. The boss doesn't care necessarily. You are forced to play along with a system that may not work in your interests, and yet you're told all the time you need to have more to get more in order to succeed. The third perspective is interactionism, and here again the metaphor society is like a conversation. Symbols are used by humans to interact. This perspective can be very cleverly applied to thinking about crime and deviance, especially this notion of labeling theory. And what I'd really like you to note here is this is primarily the work of Edwin Lemert that I'm going to discuss here. Howard Becker is also connected with it, but primarily this is the work of Lemert. And the first idea that Lemert promoted is that we all engage in primary deviance. Every single one of you watching this, you have done crime. And I don't mean necessarily big crime, but we've all done things like jaywalking, maybe some type of petty theft, taking objects from work that don't belong to us home. We've all engaged in traffic violations, okay? So primary deviance means everybody, because we're all law violators. But the thing is that people who are deviant conform most of the time, okay? They violate norms, but by and large, human beings are conformist. And the thing is that in our world, typically you aren't considered deviant or criminal until you're officially labeled. Okay? You may do a criminal act many, many times, but not be seen as a criminal until the law applies that label to you. And there are some rather shocking examples of this if you think about it. One thing I like to think about is drunk driving and the prevalence of drunk driving. It's hard to imagine this, but studies have shown that sometimes the average number of times that someone is driven drunk before getting caught and labeled is 200. So think about that the next time you're out on a Friday or Saturday night, and the extent to which labeling then is used to apply to consider somebody criminal or not, okay? And the idea with this taking on the label, being officially labeled, and feeling that you have done a crime, that is a shift, Lemert said, toward becoming a secondary deviant. It's a change in your identification of yourself because others have identified you in that way. And that is, again, symbolic interaction. Somebody has been labeled with a symbol, and there's a change in the process of how that person's thought of. Also important, though, again, is the role of power and differential enforcement of law related to this. Powerless people are far more likely to be targeted by authorities because, frankly, it's easier to target them. And studies have shown that the social distance between a person who's in authority, okay, and a target can affect whether or not a label is applied. So, for example, well-to-do youth might be treated very differently than poor youth because an officer enforcing the law might recognize that these people have resources to fight a label as opposed to these other people who do not. Imagine that you have been formally labeled, convicted of a crime. Let's say you've been convicted of burglary, okay? You didn't do the crime, but you've been labeled. What would be the effects of that? And that's the next topic I want to discuss. Even if you didn't do something, labels have effects. So, one, stigma. You're going to have strong societal reactions to your new label, and that's going to limit you. Most people, most of the time when you fill out a job application and it has that little box, it always says, I have not been convicted of a felony, and you check it and you think, ha ha ha, no, of course not. Well, from that point forward, you would have that conviction. And so that would limit things like your job opportunities, your ability perhaps even to get housing. When I wanted an apartment here in Kearney, they asked for 3 references. If the last place you lived was, for example, Lincoln Correctional Center, you might not get apartments. It also might limit your ability to get credit. All right? You might have a change in how your family or your friends relate to you. So you might have a limitation of contacts with people who you could call conventional, law-abiding people. And these things all together might result in your having low self-esteem, a negative sense of yourself. So what's important too about this is that people always say, oh, if you do the crime, you do the time. Okay? But labeling theorists would argue that the effects of doing a crime being labeled last far longer than any sentence usually does. And that changes the person's status and identity and sense of self. There are a few more theories to look at in your textbook related to crime. This one is fun to think about because the person who created it, Edwin Sutherland, grew up in Gibbon, Nebraska, of all places. And believe it or not, he went to high school and college, I believe, in Grand Island. But this was in the late 1800s, and so amazing in a sense because he's one of the premier American criminologists who's actually from this area of the country and the world. His theory came in response to a lot of the biological theories that were arguing that crime is the result of something physical or biological within a person. He argued that instead we should think about different associations that criminals might have. Okay, that's why it's called differential association theory. He argued that crime is learned. It doesn't sound so shocking to us, but at the time, this was a really nice theoretical corrective and addition to biological-based theories. He was saying, you learn crime from the people you associate with. You don't come out of the womb knowing how to hotwire a car or pick a lock, right? You learn these things. And how do you learn them? Small face-to-face groups. How most people learn things, okay? So the impact of your friends and environment is something that Sutherland brought to the table. Eventually, some other theorists developed an amendment to or addition to Sutherland's idea. So Ronald Ackers created differential reinforcement. Here's what I'd like you to know. Differential association is who you associate with. Differential reinforcement means it isn't just who you associate with, but whether or not you receive punishment or reward for doing certain things. So differential reinforcement takes differential association and adds a psychological element to explaining why people do crime. So the notion here, norm violation can be rewarded or sanctioned depending on who you hang out with. Maybe you hang out with a group of people who think, generally acting deviant is cool, but if you shoplift from a local store, they may say, hey, that's not cool, that's going to hurt that small business, and we like that store. So you learn not to do it in that context. Travis Hershey came up with a rather cool theory himself about crime, which is fun to think through. And his name for this, social bond theory. The idea is embedded within the name, social bonds. Instead of thinking about why is it that some people commit crime, he asked, what stops the majority of us from committing crime or deviating? And that's a different theoretical perspective that opened up some interesting ideas. The primary thing he found was social bonds inhibit us, the majority of people, from committing crime. And he looked at, in particular, juveniles. He said things like, for example, attachments to other people who conform will inhibit our tendencies toward crime. So maybe you've had that moment where you've thought to yourself, wow, if I do this, my parents wouldn't think much of me, and I would be jeopardizing my relationships with these people. So those are attachments that you have to other people. Commitment to conventional norms. Over time, over the lifespan, you reproduce your abiding by norms over and over again, and eventually you come to be committed to them. So much so that you might actually feel a little bit sick if you were to violate those norms. Involvement in conventional activities. When Travis Hershey looked at juveniles, he found that kids who go to, for example, after-school programs and other types of things, that means that they don't have the time to engage in bad behavior. They're too involved in conventional activities. And that's a really good policy implication if you want to reduce juvenile delinquency. How could you do it? You could promote more after-school programs, give kids things to do besides bad behavior. Finally, Hershey argued that if you believe in social norms, that's also going to inhibit you from acting criminally or delinquently. Just a few more slides, so hang in there. I know we're covering a lot. A couple more theories to discuss, and then we'll talk about the criminal justice system itself. This is a fun name for someone who's a criminologist, Walter Reckless, and he came up with a theory called Containment Theory, which is something that you can visualize. What I like to do, I'll draw it here, is concentric circles. And the idea is that containment is going to help kids resist becoming criminals through socialization. So at this point here, you have an inner containment, which are internalized norms, okay? Attitudes, values of the child. So again, to draw this, okay? If you have internalized norms, you have inner containments that stop you from bad behavior. If you don't have those internalized norms, then you need a second force, outer containments, to stop you from acting badly. So kids who never learn how to behave or what constitutes right and wrong in the general public, other forces need to come into play. Outer containments like parents, teachers, and police will need to be using this idea of, hey, you need to stop now. This is not appropriate behavior. So inner containments, if you learn those things as a kid, that's preventing you, and it stops the need for outer containments to prevent delinquency and crime. Techniques of neutralization are what I like to think of as language-based ways of understanding how criminals get past their conventional values that they hold. Okay, so most criminals hold pretty conventional values most of the time. Okay, you have to in order to act in society. Yet, in order to engage in crime or bad behavior, Sykes and Matza said they come up with these mental tricks, if you will, techniques that allow them to drift away from those values for a period of time and do something bad. It lets them get over, that inhibition. And their techniques, attitudes that allow them to neutralize behavior and drift away from conventional ways of doing things. So sometimes this theory is also called drift theory. There are 5 techniques, and in your notes you can add examples of these. They're also discussed in your textbook on page 187, if you follow along. First, denial of responsibility. The way I like to think of this is if somebody, for example, wants to say that they missed a class, there's certain excuses that go over better than others. One would be, for example, I was sick, or I got a flat tire. And so the trick here is to think, okay, the person knows, you're responsible for coming to class, but you're also making an appeal to say, I'm aware I'm responsible, but I wasn't responsible for getting sick or having the flat tire. That was out of my control. So that's why I violated the norm or the rule or the law. Okay, that's denial of responsibility. You can add that to your notes. Second example, denial of injury. Okay, this is the notion you can add to your notes. Nobody got hurt, right? So if you go and vandalize something out on campus today, you could say, well, nobody really got hurt from that. There's no injury. So that's a technique of neutralization. Third, denial of a victim. Sometimes this is called denial of an innocent victim. Here, the idea is that the victim somehow brought this on themselves. You could say, for example, in cases of rape, rapists have often used this to say, well, she brought it on herself. She wore, provocative clothing, she was drinking, she was out at the bar late, and that's saying this person is hardly innocent. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's a perfect example of this technique of neutralizing the victim, denial of an innocent victim, and something that rapists often will claim. Condemning the condemners. An example of this is if, for example, you were smoking and your parents also smoke, and you were, say, a teenager, you could start smoking, and they would say, hey, you shouldn't do that, that's wrong. You might say, hey, what gives? You do this all the time. Okay? You're condemning their hypocrisy. One other example is that a joke would go around in Los Angeles, and the joke was, what's the biggest gang in LA? Gang members would tell this joke, what's the biggest gang in LA? And the answer was the LAPD, condemning the condemners. They're hypocrites. Appeal to higher loyalties is a fascinating technique of neutralization. My gang made me do it. Or, in order to be part of this group, I had to do it. So this is an appeal by people like, for example, suicide bombers or terrorists. You can think to yourself, as one example, there might be kids in a gang who would never have done the behavior they did individually, but for the fact that they joined a gang. So none of those kids had ever thought, for example, about doing a drive-by shooting into a group of people at a party. They would have never thought of that on their own, but they did it as an appeal to a higher loyalty, a gang wanting them to. Deterrence theory is the cornerstone for criminal justice systems in the United States. And it's the idea that people are going to be deterred from bad behavior, criminal behavior, if there's a negative social sanction that's perceived to be swift, certain, and severe. So, as an example of deterrence theory, I always think about those signs on Interstate 80 that sit just below the speed limit sign. They're usually in orange. Do you know what they say? Fines doubled. Now, why would there be this strange doubling of the fine in this one place on the interstate? It's in orange because it's related to a construction zone. There are people working there. So they want to make sure those people are safe. And the way that they try to do it is say, look, you act badly in this space, you speed here, you're jeopardizing human life, and therefore we're going to double the penalty if you're caught doing that. So this is deterrence theory. Okay, we have one set of laws that say don't speed, but we really want to make sure you don't speed there. And if you want real deterrence, then if you see police officers monitoring that area, you think, wow, I really ought to obey the law, because there's a higher likelihood that punishment will be swift, certain, and severe. One slide as an example of some of these debates. The very last part of your chapter deals with types of crime, and sociologists and criminologists create typologies, which are categorization schemes, in order to understand the world. So you say, okay, here's this type of crime, this type of crime, and this type of crime. How should we approach each one differently? How are they usefully separated? And you can do that in very basic ways by saying, okay, violent crime includes things like murder, assault, rape. So that's a very different type than property crime. One thing that's useful to think about, you can add it to your notes here. Individuals, as it says, are more likely to be victims of property crime than violent crime. Now here's the thing though. We are much, much more concerned with violent crime. and we pay a lot more attention to it, primarily because of that line I think I've told you before. In media accounts, if it bleeds, it leads. The lead story on the news, for example, out of Lincoln on any given day, is likely going to have to do with violent crime, and particularly something like murder. Okay, so our perception is that violent crime is much more prominent than it is, and that sadly causes us to ignore the possibility that we're much more likely to have an encounter with property crime or to lose our stuff. So this plays into, again, that idea in the chapter and the book itself. Things are not always as they seem, and why some of these studies might be useful in your own life. Another category, victimless crime, is sometimes called vice. It's sometimes also called public order crime. And here, the victims are participants, willing participants. The line I always say to people is that you don't ever see someone run up to a police officer and say, "Oh, officer, I've been a victim of prostitution," right? Because that would mean that you've participated in a crime, okay? Gambling is another example of a victimless crime, where the victim is the participant as well, if gambling is illegal in a particular place. A third example, drug use, usually. Illegal drug use. Lastly, the criminal justice system is composed of three general parts I'd like you to know. The police you could think of as the first line of defense against crime. And so their two roles are catching criminals and maintaining order so as to prevent crime. Most people know about the catching criminals part, but they don't think, for example, about the police officers who are outside of a center after a big game who are working to direct traffic. So they're maintaining order in order to prevent accidents, crimes from happening. Courts you could think of as the second line of defense against crime. And it's a very, as I have in this slide here, very politicized arena. Politics always involves power. And what that means is that in court, negotiations occur between those people who are the defendants in a criminal case and the people who are prosecuting it. So negotiations occur. Well, prosecutors might say, this person, we don't think we can get them for first-degree murder, but we think we have a strong case for second-degree murder. And then that defendant may plea to a lesser crime because they're afraid they might get convicted. So the courts are very much politicized with negotiations. And I used to like to think about justice as being something with a capital J that was clear to everyone. Everyone should know what counts as true justice. But the court system belies the fact that true justice is really something that doesn't exist. It's an ideal. What we have is lowercase j justice, the negotiations where people see what counts as just or not. And what's fascinating is usually after a big court case, you can watch the people who are the families of the victims, and they'll say, well, justice wasn't served if they didn't get a sentence that they thought was inappropriate. Okay, so justice is, you could say, somewhat in the eye of the beholder, and it's something that we as humans have to figure out how to do. Not everybody agrees on what justice is. Prisons. This is a massively controversial thing these days. And the reason is because we use them so frequently to deal with crime in the United States now. We also use them more than any other nation on earth, probably, and it seems like without any doubt we incarcerate more of our citizens than any industrialized nation. We're not sure about China and some other nations because it's hard to get accurate statistics, but we incarcerate more of our own citizens than any other industrialized nation. And that comes at a cost. Our incarceration rates have gone up 4 times since 1975. So we've increasingly incarcerated. And that raises a lot of issues, not the least of which are issues of overcrowding. Increasingly, prisoners are being let go in California because there aren't prisons to hold them. And there's even been this process, they call it hot bunking, which refers, as I understand it, to life on ships, Navy ships. People would work in shifts, 24-hour shifts, and they had a limited number of beds. So it's called hot bunking because somebody would get into a bed that someone else had just been in. It would still be warm. And that kind of thing has been happening more and more in prisons, which raises the question of, is this cruel and unusual punishment? A basic psychological need that human beings have is to have some space of their own. And when they don't have that, that can cause very antisocial behaviors. Okay? So what's the cost of our rush to incarcerate? Some people would say maybe we should have alternatives to prison, like rehabilitation programs, halfway houses, and in particular for drug-related crimes, using treatment centers. Some people argue that our prisons are the new asylums for people with mental health problems. Is that an appropriate place for somebody who's mentally ill to be? What percentage of prisoners have mental illness, and should there be another way of addressing this? But California, for example, spends more money on prisons than on education. And that raises some real questions about what works and what should we fund versus what do people think we ought to do. Because politicians are very, very keen on saying, I'm going to get tough on crime. People elect those politicians. Nobody's wanting to get soft on crime. But if you're putting away more and more people, it's an open question of where are those people going to go after their term is served? And are they going to have the skills to be able to function within a society? So there are two potential purposes, you could say, for prison. You have punishment, and you also have rehabilitation. Can prison serve both purposes? Because punishment is about retribution. And I have a friend, I try to have friends of very different types, who says a pretty nasty line. He says, we send bad people to prison so that they will be raped. If that is what you feel prison is for, then it's, many people would argue, doing that quite well. But if you want people to be able to function once they're out of prison, then reform is an ideal. And can one institution do both things? Which relates to our final slide. That ran in The Guardian a few years ago. The idea that we have a punishment addiction, that these days we incarcerate, as I said, more citizens than any other nation, and that it's big business. And there are companies now, private companies, that build prisons, and so they have an interest in having more and more prisoners. But again, does this work as a policy? And are there ways to think about integrating people or dealing with crime in ways that might actually lead to more reform, rehabilitation, and something that we all have to face because we have a limited pool of money for public funds. That pool of money has to be used for things like schools and education as well. It needs to be used for roads, bridges, basic maintenance of our social world. So how we address these things is going to inform the quality of social life. And there is no one right way, but I want to leave you with thinking about this because it's a pressing social issue.